Deadlock at the UN, the vote on a ceasefire in Gaza delayed yet again until tomorrow. With the humanitarian catastrophe described as unspeakable by aid agencies, diplomats have been desperately searching for the right words to lead to a suspension in fighting.
Gazans are experiencing unprecedented levels of starvation and thirst, while doctors lack even the most basic of medical supplies to treat the wounded.
The vote had been due tonight, but for a second time this week has been delayed as intense discussions over the language the US might deem acceptable continue. Dan is at the UN and will bring us the latest, also tonight. After 33 years, French woman Monique Olivier found guilty of being involved in the murder of British student Joanna Parish. Nature's spectacular. Iceland's huge volcanic eruption bursting through a 2.5-mile-long crack in the earth.
Fascinating to see just nature in action. It's just like something from a movie.
Dame Esther Ranson joins the Dignitas Clinic calling for a free vote on assisted suicide. And she just about managed not to swear this time. Lioness Mary Earp storms to Sports Personality of the Year award.
This is ITV News at 10 with Julie Etchingham.
Good evening. With the number of Palestinian dead in Gaza now reported to be nearing 20,000 and more killed there today, the United Nations Security Council is still arguing over the meaning of words. The vote for some kind of halt in the fighting, postponed from yesterday, has now been postponed again until tomorrow. The members of the Council are trying to find a written formula that will avoid the United States vetoing a resolution that would allow in supplies of aid. America's UN ambassador said he couldn't say whether the resolution would go through. That, he suggested, was above his pay grade.
The guns might seem a long way from falling silent. But despite this intense urban combat in Gaza today, there are growing hopes the fighting can be stopped, even if it's only for a few days. The toll of this conflict is now measured by the thousands of victims and by the acres which have been razed. In one of Gaza's hospitals, Mohammed bids farewell not just to his son, Ahmed, but also to his baby daughter, Aisha, both killed as they slept beside him. Their grandmother's fury directed to one man, the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu.
Does he think that by killing these children he will achieve something? Have they succeeded now? Has he achieved what he wants?
The pain felt here so far hasn't translated into action here at the UN, but that might be about to change. Today the United Nations again attempted to reach a consensus, pushing for peace in the Security Council.
An immediate humanitarian ceasefire is now an imperative.
Now it's high time to act.
Only a ceasefire can prevent greater civilian casualties.
We hope that this council will be able to shoulder its responsibility and speak out.
The United States remains a lone voice opposed to a ceasefire, concerned it would hand Hamas some sort of victory.
We must hold space for the heartbreak on all sides, for all whose lives have been disrupted and destroyed by a conflict that Hamas set in motion, that Hamas restarted after a week-long humanitarian pause, and that Hamas could once again end by simply releasing the hostages.
So a new resolution is being drafted calling for a suspension rather than cessation of the war, drafted by the only Arab representative on the council who thinks it might succeed.
I'm always hopeful, I'm optimistic person, but there's still some negotiations underway.
So the wrangling goes on to find the right wording to stop a war, which for the people of Gaza cannot end a day too soon.
So, Dan, another day and still no agreement. The stumbling blocks appear to be around the nuance of the language. Is there any chances that that could be overcome?
Well, Julie, look, this vote's been postponed again. It's now due to happen tomorrow at 4 p.m. UK time. It's the language, exactly as you say there, around this cessation or whether it's a suspension of hostilities. That's a particular problem, very politically sensitive for the United States. But also there's some real practical detail yet to be thrashed out about the mechanism for getting aid into Gaza under this potential UN resolution, which would be under the auspices of the UN. I caught the US Ambassador Robert Wood for a few words as he came out this evening, and he told me that this was being dealt with at the very senior levels.
There are a few stumbling blocks, but we're working hard to try to close those to be able to get a resolution to the council. But I can't tell you at this point. It's a grade above mine, well above mine.
Is it possible it might go into another day?
I can never rule anything out.
I've also been told by another diplomatic source that if they can get the US at least into a position where they won't use their veto and perhaps they'll abstain, then it's highly likely that the UK then would vote in favour of this, which would see this go through. Whether in practice it's implementable on the ground is a whole different question, but at least they would have got this through the Security Council. It's not the only diplomatic initiative underway. There's a high-level delegation of Hamas leaders going to Egypt tomorrow to talk about aid and other issues. There's also the director of the CIA, William Burns, who's been in Europe talking with the Qataris as well. So a lot of efforts to try and stop the fighting. The question is, will any of it actually translate into action on the ground?
OK, Dan, thank you very much indeed for that. Thank you. Now, no one had ever been convicted over the murder 33 years ago of Leeds University student Joanna Parish, who was kidnapped, raped and murdered in France. Her killer had eventually confessed after he'd been jailed for a string of similar killings, but he is dead now. Tonight, Joanna's parents were in court to see his widow found guilty of aiding and abetting her murder.
Joanna Parish was 20 years old when she was raped, beaten and strangled. For 3 decades, no one has been held accountable until now.
We now hope, after this last obstacle in our struggle to gain an element of justice for Joanna has been overcome, we can remember our daughter and sister with a smile on our faces, which is how, of course, all her many friends remember her.
In 1990, Joanna Parish moved from Gloucestershire to France to start a new life as a teaching assistant. The court heard she needed money, but didn't want to ask her parents and advertised private English lessons in the paper. Michel Fourneret replied. He'd already murdered 6 women. That night, he and his wife Monique Olivier kidnapped, tortured and killed Joanna. Together they operated for 16 years across France and Belgium, a couple with a shared obsession of hunting women. Olivier built their victims' trust, lured them in and sometimes held them down for Fourneret to attack. Fourneret, convicted of murdering 8 women and girls in 2008, confessed to killing Joanna in 2018, but died before he could stand trial again. Already serving a life sentence for her role in other murders, Olivier tried to convince the jury she was forced by her husband, but the court heard the opposite was true, that she gave her husband his licence to kill, and today apologised to the victims' families. This morning, Olivier, now 75 and looking quite weak, stood up and spoke to a packed courtroom. She told the jury, "I'm sorry for everything that I've done, and I ask forgiveness for the unpardonable, knowing that it's unforgivable." And she was shaking as she sat down directly opposite Joanna's parents, but there was no reaction from them. After almost 12 hours, the jury found her guilty of complicity in the kidnapping and murder of Joanna and 2 others. She's been handed a second life sentence.
It has been especially hard for the Parish family, who have waited 30 years for this process to conclude. But they have acted with dignity, as have all the families, and have never once cried for or shown any desire for vengeance, only for justice.
After 33 years, Joanna's parents have some justice for their daughter. who was murdered, the judge said, by a liar who treated her victims with total indifference. Sangeeta Lal, News at 10, Nanterre.
Now, on almost the darkest day of the year, the skies of southwestern Iceland have had an almost perpetual sunrise. The horizon has been lit up not by the sun, but by a 2-mile-long volcanic eruption along a crack in the Earth's surface. Well, the eruption started last night on the Reykjanes Peninsula, just north of a fishing port called Grindavik, and about 25 miles from the capital Reykjavik. Fortunately, the lava appears to be heading away from homes and buildings, though local people were evacuated from that area earlier. Sightseers are now heading in the opposite direction, despite warnings to stay away. But scientists say there won't be ash on the scale of 2010, when planes all across Europe had to be grounded.
From the air, it is awe-inspiring, but from close up, terrifying. The mesmerising power of nature. Lava fountains danced into the air against a pitch-black Icelandic night. It was at 10:17 last night when the Earth's surface cracked and lava began to spew. A path of hot molten rock weaving its way across the Reykjanes Peninsula for 2.5 miles.
Fascinating to see just nature in action. It's just like something from a movie.
There is a lot going on, and a town involved, which might end up under the lava.
That town is Grindavik, where warnings have been seen since late October. High above it, rescue teams patrol the eruption site, turning volcano tourists away.
This lava is difficult to walk across. There are cracks and holes in it which are dangerous. There is a sheet of snow covering these cracks in places, but they are very unstable. It is easy to fall into those cracks.
The land of fire and ice is used to defending itself because Iceland is a hotspot for volcanic activity, positioned over tectonic plates moving in opposite directions.
This plate boundary is cracking every few months or so, and there is magma coming from depth and filling in the voids. The lava is spreading out quite fast. It is closer to infrastructure and people. So the threat is definitely there.
In 2010, this Icelandic volcano created a huge ash cloud, grounding European air travel for more than a week. There is no such emergency this time. The direction in which this burning rock will move is unpredictable, though. But the theatre of the natural world too fascinating not to watch. Lucy Watson, News at 10.
Astonishing images. Now, more high earners in Scotland are to pay more income tax than their counterparts in the rest of the United Kingdom with the creation of a new tax band. The 45 pence in the pound rate will affect Scots' earnings of £75,000 or more a year. For the rest of the UK, people only pay that much if they are earning over £125,000. The SNP government said it wants the money to spend more on public services and the NHS.
If Christmas is the season for giving, then the Scottish Government budget isn't looking too festive. Income tax increases have been deemed the only way to help balance the books, while facing a £1.5 billion funding gap and without the power to borrow.
When public services need investment and protection from Tory cuts, this government does believe that those with the broadest shoulders should pay a higher rate of tax.
Scots already pay more tax than those elsewhere in the UK. Anything over £125,000 in Scotland is taxed at 47%, compared to 45% elsewhere. But this rate in Scotland is going to 48%. And they've added a new advance rate of 45% for earnings between £75,000 and £125,000. Some of those facing the advance rate are doctors and consultants in the NHS. Dr John Montgomery hopes the money raised will go to helping with staffing shortages.
And if that helps deliver the public services that we need, particularly in areas like Govan, where it's so desperately needed, then I have absolutely no problems with that whatsoever. When I hear of people earning vast sums of money and able to avoid paying tax by sheltering in tax havens, the like, that, I'm afraid, grates on me a great deal.
Opposition parties were quick to criticise the budget.
This is a chaotic budget from an incompetent government that will leave ordinary Scots paying much more and getting much less in return.
I take it what Michael Mara is confirming today is that the Labour Party would see £82 million less investment in public services. So that is now on the record.
There's further divergence with England, as again there will be no business rate relief for mainland Scotland, affecting businesses like Pure Spa.
I have a spa in Bristol that costs £3,500 a year, and an equivalent spa up here is 4 times, so I'm looking at 10 to 15,000 for a business up here, which is an enormous amount to ask businesses to pay in the current climate.
It's been deemed the toughest budget since devolution, but with a general election looming, public backing is even more critical. Louise Scott, News at 10, Holyrood.
In Wales, business rates on shops, pubs and restaurants will be going up in its draft budget. Labour's Welsh Government says it wants to protect health and local council spending, but there will be other spending cuts. The Finance Minister blamed 13 years of austerity, a botched Brexit deal and the cost of living crisis. In Northern Ireland, there are no ministers in the Assembly there to stabilise its budget. The Assembly hasn't sat for nearly 2 years. Talks today to try to get the Democratic Unionist Party to agree to restore the Assembly have ended, despite a take-it-or-leave-it offer of more than £3 billion for Northern Ireland. Carl's here to, first of all, really just take us through what's been going on and whether this really is the end of the road.
Well, the Northern Ireland Secretary, Chris Heaton-Harris, tried to signal the end of the road today, but as we know in these things, it is always possible to construct a little bit more road, isn't it? What he offered today was £3.3 billion for Northern Ireland's budget next year, a 24% increase on where it had been, but on the condition that the Assembly and the Executive get back up and running to work with that money. That isn't happening, as many people will remember, because the DUP are boycotting it because they don't like the post-Brexit trading arrangements, the so-called Irish Sea border, despite the Windsor framework that the Prime Minister put in place to get rid of much of that. So that's where we are. The big surprise today, particularly, as you're about to hear for the DUP, was when the Northern Ireland Secretary walked out and declared the talks effectively over.
These financial talks have concluded, and there is a financial package worth in excess of £3 billion on the table should the executive be restored. From our perspective, the Windsor framework talks on all issues of substance have effectively concluded.
Well, the Secretary of State certainly hasn't told us inside that the talks and the talking is over. I think I heard him say out here that if parties continue to have concerns, he will continue to talk to the parties.
As to what happens next, well, in theory, the Secretary of State is supposed to call an election if there hasn't been any change by the 18th of January. In practice, that has been moved before and can very well be moved again, especially as many people don't think an election might actually get us anywhere particularly different. Now, it is possible that in that time, the DUP might be able to wring some more concessions, as Jeffrey Donaldson seems to think he could, from the Westminster government, although listening to Chris Heaton-Harris today saying, I've finished talking about money, I've finished talking about the Windsor framework, you do get the impression that the Westminster government's patience is wearing rather thin.
Off for Christmas. All right, Carl, thank you very much indeed for that. Thank you. The Prime Minister hasn't had a lot of luck with by-elections this year. Now there'll be another near the start of next year. Voters in the constituency of Peterbone, elected as a Conservative, have decided to trigger a by-election after a parliamentary report found that he had committed acts of bullying and one of sexual misconduct. More than 10% of the electorate, the threshold needed, said they wanted the chance of a change. Schools in England that have been left to work out for themselves how to respond to pupils questioning their gender identity have finally been given some guidance. The Department for Education says teachers should inform parents they don't have to use the pupils' chosen pronouns and can still refer to them as girls and boys.
Being here and being called Newton and he and going on the TV is very affirming.
But Newton says he's not always been made to feel comfortable about who he is. 4 years ago, at the age of 11, he came out as transgender to teachers at his school. It was an experience that he says left him feeling lost and alone.
Everyone talking about my identity instead of to me about my identity was very isolating, and how I just wasn't a part of that conversation. Children should not have to have permission for simply using different pronouns and names for themselves. That's hurting no one.
But long-awaited guidance published by the Department for Education today says schools don't have to let pupils change their pronouns, names or uniforms, which is known as socially transitioning. It says schools should generally inform parents if their child wants to change their gender identity. Teachers won't be forced to use a child's chosen pronouns. Schools should provide single-sex changing facilities and toilets, and children who wish to change their gender identity will be banned from taking part in contact sports with members of the opposite biological sex.
Just because a child doesn't conform to gender stereotypes doesn't mean that they are the opposite sex. We shouldn't assume that because a boy likes pink or a girl likes football that they are of the opposite sex. We need to make sure that schools understand what is going on.
But do they? The founder of a trust which runs 54 academies in England says the guidelines are impractical and put too much of the pressure on already overstretched schools.
Teachers don't train to offer advice and support and wise counsel to a child struggling with their sexuality or their gender. They train in history or geography or maths or English. Therefore, support and guidance, but deeper guidance than just a sentence or two, is absolutely necessary.
But some campaigners claim schools should be doing more and say so should the guidelines.
It's a basic of safeguarding that any changes in a child's behaviour or appearance should be thoroughly investigated, and we're concerned this isn't happening in schools. This guidance will still leave children vulnerable.
Newton says that what left him feeling most vulnerable was not being listened to. He fears the government's new guidance will leave other children and teenagers feeling exactly the same way. Chloe Keedy, News at 10.
China's deadliest earthquake for nearly a decade has killed at least 130 people in a cold and mountainous part of the country in the northwest. It was a 6.2 magnitude quake, but was only 6 miles down, hence so much destruction.
The earthquake struck late at night while many were asleep in their beds. Shaken people pulled from the rubble, shocked again by sub-freezing temperatures outside. CCTV footage shows people fleeing restaurants, flinging themselves downstairs, and students breaking through locked doors to escape. The 6.2 magnitude quake was not the biggest, but it was shallow, so 20 seconds of this was able to do this. When daylight came, it revealed the scale of the damage. Villages split in two, roads submerged. Only those buildings propped up by mudslides still standing. With their homes gone, people camped in neat rows of tents, trying to keep warm in temperatures as low as -15. The fear of aftershocks is real, and authorities warn that there could be days of them. President Xi Jinping has ordered thousands of troops to head to the mountainous region, which is one of the poorest and most ethnically diverse in the country. Darkness and temperatures have fallen again in China. This earthquake is already its deadliest for many years. The race is on to stop it claiming even more lives. Yasmin Bottleby, News at 10.
Ukraine's President Zelensky insisted today his country was not going to lose the war against Russia. He said enemy troops had failed to achieve any of their goals for this year. He did admit, though, that Ukraine still faces what he called lots of challenges. The former TV presenter Dame Esther Rantzen has spent the latter half of her career campaigning for dignity in life for older people. Now, with stage 4 cancer, she said she is thinking about dignity in death. She sparked a debate over assisted suicide, not least in her own family, after signing up for the Dignitas clinic in Switzerland.
Best known as the presenter of That's Life.
But we aren't blocking this pavement. But we aren't, really we aren't.
Yes, sure.
Dame Esther Rantzen has spent a lifetime campaigning and founded Silverline to support older people. But after being told she has stage 4 lung cancer, the 83-year-old's revealed she's considering assisted suicide.
You know, I have joined Dignitas. I have, in my brain, thought, well, if the next scan says nothing's working, I might buzz off to Zurich. But, you know, it puts my family and friends in a difficult position because they would want to go with me. And that means that the police might prosecute them. So we've got to do something. At the moment, it's not really working, is it?
3 years ago, Dame Esther's daughter Rebecca Wilcox joined her in a documentary about grief. She says her mum should be allowed to choose a dignified death without breaking the law.
I'm going through, hypothetically, the worst grief I've been through so far, and I'm having to face a court case that I effectively enabled my mother to die, manslaughter, whatever it is. It's unthinkable that that could be the law now.
Last year, 33 Brits travelled to Switzerland to end their life at Dignitas, but assisting a suicide is currently illegal in all parts of the UK, despite previous attempts to change the law. And campaign groups like Care Not Killing believe legalising it would not lead to better outcomes.
We know that there is a significant epidemic of elder abuse and financial abuse of older people, and people who are caring for their elderly relatives could either deliberately or unconsciously put a lot of pressure onto them.
The Isle of Man is already considering legislation to allow assisted suicide for its residents, and a members' bill is planned for Scotland. Now Dame Esther's calling for a free vote in Parliament on legalising assisted dying. Martha Fairley, News at 10.
Finally, there's no doubting her sporting prowess nor her personality. In the summer, England's Mary Earps was the goalkeeper of the tournament at the World Cup. Her big personality extended beyond the pitch into that row with kit makers Nike over their failure to make a replica shirt with her name and number on. So no prizes for guessing who's been voted this year's BBC Sports Personality of the Year.
She's been tremendous. BBC Sports Personality of the Year.
Mary Earps.
Not bad for a woman who 4 years ago was so upset at being dropped by England, she considered leaving the game.
It's not been the easiest journey, and I definitely wouldn't be where I am today without a number of incredible people in my corner. So finally, I just want to say thank you to them. I'm so glad that I can bring some of my loved ones with me today. I'm not going to look at them directly in the eye because that will get a bit much. And who've been with me through the really, really not so great times. And yeah, the last 2 years have been absolutely unbelievable.
Earps had an outstanding World Cup and increased her
so much passion, I think you could see.
Yeah, can you remind us what you said afterwards?
I don't remember, I don't recall.
Mary Earps' combative nature saw her take on the England kit sponsor Nike, forcing them to put replicas of her goalkeeping shirts on sale. Tonight, Earps says she wants to spend Christmas reflecting on an incredible year which allowed her to fulfil her wildest dreams, topped by winning what she describes as the ultimate all-round sporting accolade. Nick Wallace, News at 10.
And congratulations from all of us to Mary. That is all for tonight. We will see you tomorrow. Good night.